Thanks everyone here at the Museum of Wisconsin Art for inviting me to speak today. Thank you for all spending your time in the building rather than outside. I'm really grateful to talk about many artists who I had the privilege to know personally, and some I knew really well, some I've only just met a couple times, because for me, all of this begins and ends with artists. So before I start, I just wanted to say that I'm honored to be a guest on the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk Menominee Potawatomi people, who together with elders and future generations continue to steward and respect this living earth. I humbly offer my work as a way to honor these relations, many of whom I call friends. So my talk today is going to take more than 3 routes. We'll be lucky if it doesn't meander out of control. But in considering what to highlight, I thought about the way in which some artists use landscape meaningfully to explore themselves, where they are in life, what is their place in the world, physically, emotionally, psychologically. And some artists use landscape as a way to explore the life cycle and their own mortality. It's one and the same to them in dealing with nature and the land. They're always thinking about themselves and how they're connected to it. And others allegorize personal experiences in a setting that they knew intimately. Some try to give viewers a sense of what it felt like to be in a particular place, the spiritual and visceral sensations of natural phenomena, and others use natural materials to honor the living landscape. I'll end with a personal account of art and nature in Wisconsin that might otherwise be overlooked. So we take place for granted, the histories and sacred associations, the rejuvenating capacity of being in nature, I think. Our lives are set up in a way so that we stay away from wild places, and these wild places are in turn endangered, in part because our culture knows their magic less and less. It is out of sight and unfamiliar. Paintings can be a way to show how wonderful things can be, says Tom Uttech, for instance. Maybe they will make people interested in the environment and then grow to love it. That can lead to knowledge and then concern. This work is as useful as a direct criticism of polluters. That's one point of view of how making a landscape today, the 2020s, can be political and active and about trying to perpetuate the idea that these things are preserved, that Tom Uttech talks about. Truman Lowe, the Ho-Chunk sculptor, says, when you know where you are, when you're really grounded in that, and you're aware of the history and where you are in relationship to that, but also the meaning of place, you are more complete. So much of this art is about mindfulness, integrating self and place, landscape, and identity. As I'm talking about this and showing you some images, I wonder, when you're up in the gallery looking at the show, you think about some of these questions. So, is it really possible to represent landscape? In the complex ways that people try to do that, is that why so many artists integrate themselves into it? And how does landscape get inside you and change you? We're talking about Wisconsin, of course, and Wisconsin's unique geographical features, especially the driftless area, untouched in the movement of the Laurentian ice sheet 17,000 years ago, left landscape features that have attracted people for thousands and thousands of years. The river valleys, the lakes, the forests, and things like that. And so, of course, Wisconsin then was marketed as a destination for people around the country to come and vacation. It was vacation land. But also marketed to people in the state. Why leave the state when you have all of these places that you can visit right here? And so by 1856, Kilbourne City, which became Wisconsin Dells, had a railroad line that went to it. So already before the Civil War, there's tourism going to these particular places to see these natural sites. And then auto tourism by 1922 is bringing people throughout the state in new ways. And artists, of course, found the state full of gorgeous and dramatic places to draw and paint. The first group of people that I'm going to talk about are these folks. We have a group of artists in 1942. This photograph was taken on May 30th, 1942, on the event of the artist Sylvia Fine, who is still alive and well and painting at 103 in Martinez, California now, from Wisconsin originally, who is here in the center. She's seated and looking off to the left. And then her husband, they just married, Bill Sugar, has the hat on his hand and standing with Sylvia. And then artist friends are around them. So Dudley Huppler on the far left in the black hat. John Wilde is up above behind him. Marshall Glasier is up on the right with his hand on Gene Webster's shoulder. And then Helen Ashman Wilde, who is also an artist and a fashion designer, is standing here. They're here in Blue River. Well, they were married in Blue River, and then this group went to Castle Rock to get this picture taken. And it's important because this is just west of Muscadet, where Huppler was from. They went out to that landscape, the Wisconsin River Valley, to draw and paint in the site over and over and over again. It was something that they did constantly, guided really by Marshall Glasier. They never forgot the lessons that they learned out in that landscape about stewardship and ecology and the environment, and about what that experience is like being out there, and then how it entered their art and transformed the way they thought about themselves and how to make imagery. And Marshall was really, who was 17 years older than a lot of the artists in that circle, was really the ringmaster of this. He had studied at the Art Students League with George Gross in New York, and came back to Wisconsin in 1936 at the age of 34, and got involved with a younger circle of artists who became his close friends. But also he mentored them. And Glasier was somebody who drew obsessively. He's actually an artist in residence at Reed College here in this picture in the 1950s. And when he went out into the landscape, he would draw things like this. So this is an ink drawing that he did in the Wisconsin River Valley of bluffs and everything else that he was seeing. And you can see that the style of drawing is really fast, it's rapid. He's really closely observing what he's seeing in front of him, but it isn't a straight naturalism. There's something more in there, something energetic. And Sylvia Fine talks about the way that Marshall painted or drew. She said it was almost like he was wrestling with it. He would go in, and it was very physical, and it was really something that had to be viscerally engaged with, in addition to him really thinking about hand and eye. But this is the kind of landscape that was inside Glasier. He drew and painted over and over and over and over again, and taught these younger artists to really appreciate and draw and incorporate in their work. And so the kind of paintings that he would do in the Wisconsin River Valley is stuff like this mostly. He said there's a poetry and expression in the jutting rocks, the bluffs and gnarled trees in the driftless area, happy fusion of the real and unreal in the landscape. And he loved that kind of contrast between things that he saw, that he observed, that are reproduced with a kind of fidelity to that experience, but also something more that seems that it's almost about his body. So this is a painting from 1944 called The Life of the Cabbage. And so for Glasier, part of this is depicting what he saw in that landscape, but then putting right there in the center this cabbage that is full of its growth. It's at the peak of ripeness, but then it's also starting to turn, because you see one of those leaves that are wilting. And then the insects are starting to come and check it out and see if there's anything to start degrading. So all of those things are in there, and Marshall felt like that could be getting at greater issues of life and death in the life cycle, and also our relationship to these things, because after all, this is something that's grown to be eaten, ingested, and to perpetuate life. So that's the kind of thing that Glasier sought and tried to depict a landscape, which, I think if you're thinking about how these folks from that circle relate to some of the material that's upstairs, this 1958 mural that's on view for the first time in half a century by John Holt, shares some of that idea of subjectivity in the self, and thinking about landscape in a way that, is clearly based on things that the artist observed, but then also has these other elements that come from subjectivity, come from changing things and shifting things around. With John Colt, this feels like when you stand in front of it, even though there's this quote that says he's not interested in the panoramic, he's interested in looking at nature up close. It feels like it's the cosmos, but it's also things under a microscope. It's that shifting back and forth, the macrocosm, the microcosm. It also feels like he's really paying attention to this idea of what happens when you're in a fall landscape and it seems, you almost catch yourself, that the trees are on fire. So that kind of sensation. So that intensity is something that Glasier and some of these people in his circle were interested in, but they're not the only ones. So I think John Colt is somebody who's also thinking along those lines, even though they're articulated very differently. But Glasier and his circle were really, they're aware of what else is going on in Wisconsin and in the American art world, in fact, the international art world, because they're getting international magazines and looking at the developments around the world. But really feel like privileging place and knowing, painting what you know, painting that intimate landscape of your life is really critical. But they're rejecting things like what Edmund Lewandowski is doing, another artist who's working in Wisconsin at the time, who's interested in industry and the developments around Milwaukee and other places in Wisconsin that show, that kind of progress. So these circuit breakers paintings from 1947, for instance, Wilde and Fine and Glasier, there's none of this kind of material in their work. They're deliberately looking away from that. And they're also rejecting the kind of painting that somebody like John Stewart Curry is doing as not having enough of an edge or a psychological content. Whether or not you agree with that, that is the position from which Glasier and the circle were thinking. In fact, there's a lot of very colorful letters back and forth between Glasier and other people in his circle about Glasier's impressions of John Stewart Curry that are not, maybe not for polite company, but are very interesting and hilarious, but show you what kind of a disdain that he had for him. He felt like Curry's work was commercial, and he was also kind of somebody who was coming in from the outside. He wasn't from Wisconsin. In 1936, the same year that Glasier comes back to Wisconsin from studying in New York, and becomes the first artist in residence at the School of Agriculture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he's going around the state and meeting people, artists, rural artists, but he's also painting Wisconsin landscapes, which Glasier felt a great propriety of, and felt that Curry was not really giving it the kind of due for the wildness that it had that he wanted to show in his own work. So a painting like this from 1942 by John Stewart Curry gets a lot of national attention and really riles Glasier's, personality up and makes him defensive and angry because it wins the Temple Gold Medal and Purchase Prize at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And so that's where it is now. But you can see it's this very neat and tidy, in some ways, image of the tailored land by farmers and people who are cultivating the land, rather than that expanse that Glasier was interested in. It's messy. It's about overgrowth and about all these kinds of things that happen in the wild. And Glasier was so, sort of antagonistic to Curry that when Curry was also sort of being the spokesperson of Wisconsin art, he made a satirical painting that's in part based on this photograph that was published in the Milwaukee Journal of Curry judging a rural Wisconsin art exhibition in 1940 at the Wisconsin Memorial Union, which is this. And it's called John Stewart Curry and the University of Wisconsin Bull Breeding Machine from 1948. He had the grace of doing it 2 years after Curry died, so Curry didn't see this in his lifetime, but you can see that this is kind of what he's getting at. So what else did Glasier do? Well, the other thing that Glasier often did is he made these mythological paintings, like this one, which is called Theseus and the Monster, rather than the Minotaur from 1949, where Glasier is the person who is taking the place of some of these figures, and often the monstrous figures. Glasier is putting himself as the painter, as the artist, in that position, in that role. He was very self-conscious. He had this love-hate relationship with success. He often undermined himself. And so it's interesting to see that Glasier, not until much later in life, made straight self-portraits. He often made himself this character as part of a Greek drama set in a Wisconsin landscape, and had that also reverberate around him as though it is sort of absorbing the sense of that story. So another artist in this circle, Sylvia Fine, who was born in 1919, as I said, is still painting. She meets Glasier in the early 1940s as an 1939, as an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is taken with his personality, and also is really learning a lot from him, she says, as an artist who's interested first and foremost in drawing. This is a collaborative self-portrait that Glasier and Fine did. It's Sylvia here. She painted that, and then Glasier did the background. So they were very close. And Sylvia talks about, not only being interested in cultivating the land around her house in California now. She's become a farmer. But going back to those early days in Wisconsin, thinking about learning about gardening and those kinds of things from older people, Dudley Coupler's, or John Wilde's father, for instance, and a number of other people who were sort of guiding them and teaching them about growing their own food and talking about sustainability already at that time. And that comes down to also the way Sylvia has painted since the 1930s, which is that she doesn't buy paint out of tubes. She gets powdered pigment, which comes out of the earth, is all mineral-based, and she mixes it with an egg. So she makes egg temper paintings, and she does that herself on her palette every time she makes a painting. So it's got that unique content, and it also connects her to the earth in a different way. So the kind of pictures that Sylvia was making in the mid-1940s are, again, setting herself and putting herself in the guise of characters from myth and from the Bible to dramatize the things that were going on in her life. Both of these paintings are done in 1943 and into the early part of 1944. On the left is a painting called Eve, and on the right is a painting called Lilith. And they're both Sylvia using herself to deal with the sort of anxiety and stress of living through the Second World War. In that photo that I showed you at the beginning of all that group of artists together, that was right before both John Wilde and Bill Schubert had been drafted into the Army and went off to their respective places. And Bill was in the Pacific, Sylvia's new husband. So Sylvia also did some war work during this time, and the war really weighed heavily on her. And so the way that she dealt with this in her work is she put herself in these guise of these powerful women who were set into landscape situations, like for instance Lilith. Lilith is a defiant and powerful figure who's connected to the spirit world. She asserts her own sort of terms and desires and autonomy in different sort of traditions of that. And so Sylvia is, in a way, sort of trying to wrest control of the place of the war and the way that the war is going to go so that Bill comes back. You can't really see it in this image, but there's an image of Bill in the clouds that she's sort of appealing to. And on the left, she's talked about that Eve figure also as Persephone. She's got the pomegranate, who eats one of the kernels and then has to stay in Hades for part of the year. So she felt like that was what was happening during the war years to her. In fact, she did go into her own sort of self-exile out of the United States into Mexico during 1944 to 46, in part to escape the sort of patriotic fervor and not be reminded about the war constantly. She did a whole other body of work there. And so constantly she's using landscape and her position over it, her position in relationship to it, to deal with the situation of the war. Here is an ink drawing from 1944 that she did that shows her flying over this landscape that is sort of supposed to be a schematic image of the Pacific, where she's looking for Bill. She has in her hand a little sort of pamphlet that says Map of Australia. because he was over in that particular area, but she wasn't exactly sure where. So she's trying to find him in order to bring him home. And then finally, another painting I want to show you by Sylvia of this period is called The Tea Party, that was done in 1943. And so here she is in a recognizably Wisconsin landscape with those bluffs. And she sets herself sitting against the back, sitting at a table that is set for absent friends, most of whom have gone off to be part of the war. And it's a sort of Alice in Wonderland-like figure. And her wonderland is the Wisconsin landscape. And she's hoping that magically, if she ingests the right thing, whether she drinks something or she eats something, she can bring them back and restore the kind of collective feeling that everybody had when they were together in Madison before the war. And in this painting, Sylvia not only is thinking about how to reproduce the bluffs and give them that magical quality and get their textures and everything right, but she's also embedding in it faces and things that you start to wonder if you're hallucinating or if Sylvia put it there. There's a sort of shape-shifting, consciousness-changing experience of looking at the way she's doing the surfaces. And that all adds to the kind of feeling of her psychological state of mind. So moving on to John Wilde. John Wilde, also born in 1919 and died in 2006. John lived in Evansville, or really Cooksville, just south of Madison. He had an arboretum around his house. And John grew things. He tended to orchards. He hunted. He went out in the landscape and painted and drew, mostly drew out in the landscape. And this I'm showing you is something that John also did that he kept private, but Walter Hamady, another artist who was a friend of his, was so moved by it that he made a limited edition print, or maybe he only made one of it, and that's at the Madison Art Center. What this is one of John's charts showing year by year when he started noticing certain things coming back after the winter. So the first this particular kind of bird, this plant, he's really paying attention. So I show you this in part because this gives you a sense of how closely John was really looking at and thinking about the world around him, the natural world. And all of that comes into his art. It's affecting every way he makes paintings about birds and apples and everything else. And if you just think of John as the kind of painter of crazy, surreal scenarios, every one of those paintings is also based on his direct observation of things as they are in front of him, but also as he lives with them and tends them, grows them, and cultivates them. So along with John, being attentive to growing things, and also reading the work of Aldo Leopold and other kinds of people who are talking about Wisconsin in that way, he has friends in common, like the self-taught artist Dudley Huppler, he was a writer, but he started making drawings because he was around artists. He started making drawings, ink on paper, that are like this one on the left. It's called Dixie Queen Melon. It's a melon we know he grew in his own garden and then ate. And it's done, you can't tell from your seats, but trust me, it's done with little tiny dots. There's no lines and there's no cross-hatching and shading there. All of the gradients that you have in there that show volume is because of the accumulation of dots in particular areas. So that's the kind of technique that he came with at the time. And when he started to realize he could make drawings like this, he wrote to Sylvia Fine, "What has happened to me that somehow I have interest only in the exact and natural, the faithfully, laboriously described? I don't know. Maybe because I have no faith in the world's duration and feel a need to know the wonders of growing things for my own safety of mind. One thing I know, I now realize, nobody can know a thing like an artist who sits and looks at it and literally transcribes. It's like learning the language once again." So this is intimately tied to how they're seeing and how they're thinking about how they want to make art. And the painting on the right is by John Wilde. It's a mushroom still life. It's called Toadstools from 1952. And while this passage from his journal, is later, it's from 1960, so it's probably not about this. this also gives you a sense of how he's paying attention to the way matter behaves and how natural things behave when he's spending the time with them, depicting them. He says, "The mushroom still life was marvelous, for the group of fruits set up yesterday, pert and fresh, were literally by this afternoon degenerated into only a bare shadow of their former selves. Some were little more than a trail of dust, giving the outline of their former optimal shape. But what a manifestation of the ever-present fleetingness of anything. One day solid, substantial, voluminous, another day only residue." And so, he's obviously given us this sort of at the height of their pert and freshness. But as he's painting it, he's watching this happen because he's taking time to paint them and observe them. And all of John's work has that simultaneously in it. He's aware of the abundance and fecundity of life, but he's also keenly aware of where it's going to go and what its inevitable fate is. And with this food, he's also, like Huppler, thinking about how these are things that are grown from seed. They watch them, they cultivate them, they watch them grow, and then they ingest them and they become part of them. And so all of this are things that these artists are really thinking about, and it means something for them to also be consuming them as artists and depicting them and giving them to you. So a painting like this, John and his friend Carl Prevey were bird watchers, and in the archives at Marquette, there are lists and lists and lists of birds. They were real serious bird watchers and would send them back and forth to one another. But they're also painting them. And while Carl, I can't think of an instance in which Carl is painting a dead bird. They're almost always alive. These are night plovers, but he always adds something sort of fanciful. So they're captive night plovers from 1951 on the left. John is holding a dead bird he found. And I think that's important, that tactileness, the idea of kind of intimacy and the loving way that he's holding it and then depicting it, right down to the texture and the lines of the feathers and how they've grown. John is really taking care to do that. And it's a way of respecting what he's finding on the grounds of his home when he's walking around. Of course, while he'll do that, he's also doing things like this. In 1984, a painting called View Near Stevensville Road with the Giant Kohlrabi, where John's there and he's imagining this kohlrabi being massive. But pay attention to what's behind it. You don't often see in John's work these straight landscapes of Wisconsin. But in the background of these pictures where there's an outsized kohlrabi, that's what he's doing. So he's paying very close attention to the topography. And in a painting like this from 1987 called Homage to Philip Otto Runge, which is from a whole series of paintings that John did in homage to other artists, he's taken a detail of a painting by this early 19th century German romantic painter, Philip Otto Runge, called Morning, or The Great Morning. He's actually taken a detail from a study for that painting, which I'll show you in a minute. And he's popped it in the sky in a Wisconsin landscape. And in this painting by Runge, it's in an altarpiece form. It's this massive painting of all these putti and cupids, sort of as an allegory of the morning coming. And there's an infant on the ground, and there's all the plants and everything are just observed and reproduced with this crystal clear quality. They're very specific kinds of plants, but then the sky is amazing. And then there's all these, putti and cupids and figures that are usually reserved for religious Christian painting, but they are just welcoming the morning. So Wilde has taken one of those people out of there and put it over this Wisconsin landscape towards the end of winter, where there's this sort of stubble of the corn and wheat or whatever, other kinds of things there. And, in some ways, I guess I wonder if what John is getting at here, because he very rarely talked about willingly intention or meaning in his work, that he took that putti out of there. The putti is welcoming a rebirth of the Wisconsin landscape and the earth warming up again, and then it's going to become fecund. And so that's maybe what its purpose is there. So there's the source for what John's put in there incongruously. So before we leave John, I think one of the most ambitious things that John did his entire lifetime is this pair of paintings that was recently on view together. I don't know if they still are. They were in the fall. That he did in the 1950s and then reprised 40 years later. And that is Wilde World on the left, Provincia Naturalica Classicum, done in 1953 and 55, and Wilde World Revisited, which he did in 1995. And what this is it's a manifesto painting, really, by John, that shows everything he cared about and learned, all summed up in front of his body that is positioned in front of this stuff. So on the left side, you have a street that maybe in Evansville, of Wisconsin house facades, and people going about their business. In the center, you have a little image of John, which I'm going to show you close up in a bit, who is seated on a stone. He's actually got a drawing pad, and he's looking back at the figure of John, who's looking into the landscape. And then you have these fallen sort of stones, and stones that look like they could be some formations that he may have witnessed around the state. Some of them are fantastic and look like they're pulled out of Mantegna paintings from the Italian Renaissance. And then this temple that has carved in it Eros Thanatos, so love and death. And then frolicking naked ladies, which John almost always includes, but also he's naked somewhere in there himself. He's laid it all out in front of him, and it's this kind of ambitious, hopeful image to some extent of what John is trying to do as an artist. He's trying to bring in everything that he's sort of learned and looked at into this worldview and to show you what has made him in some ways. But it is really critical that it's not in the studio, it's taking place in a landscape. And it's a landscape that's part village, part the wild, and then part a landscape of that kind of learning that he's been doing from the Western tradition, for instance. 40 years later, we have this. John no longer is using a pencil to measure things and drawing things. He doesn't even need any of that anymore. He is simply pointing. And what he's pointing at is this vortex in the sky that is swirling around. It seems to maybe be starting to suck everything into it. And so, I thought I would read something that he said to the curator, Tino Iapelli, right before he made this painting, that may explain it. He said to somebody once, he didn't know what the difference was. I think it's even reproduced on the Milwaukee Art Museum's label. He doesn't know it's changed. Obviously something has, but I think he was keenly aware of what was changing in him. And in the world, he said, in 1993, 2 years before he made this, probably a year before he started it, change is death. There's no question about that. It is. At the same time, of course, there's another life coming along the way. That's the most important thing you have to wrestle with. The fact that you're not going to stay alive. The fact that you, like everything else, like that tree that's falling apart up there, the tree's got a disease and that tree's got broken branches. And that's one's falling down. And yet there's saplings coming up all around. But I don't think you ever really reconcile to that. That's the cruel hoax or the cruel joke. And on a very superficial level, so far as I can see, so much of the change that's taken place in the world today is for the worse. Everything is done at a huge expense to the environment, at a huge expense to human accord. At least that's where John was at that moment. And I don't want to leave you thinking that John was an eternal pessimist. He claims he was, but there are other things that he says about that. I think that what's exciting about the changes and the sort of idea that he would redo that monumental painting that got a lot of attention and press and was shown in a lot of places in the mid-1950s after John made it, really, in some ways, is this real landmark in his career and is the most ambitious painting he did until much later, again, in life, is that he's thinking also about legacy. So in this painting on the left, a little John, who's alive and well, looking back at himself. And there's this kind of mirroring that happens in the landscape. He's in his art, and his art is looking back at him. He's sort of puzzling over this idea of, what can you reproduce and to what extent can you know yourself and show yourself to an audience. On the right side, what's happened is John has made himself into this kind of statue, that's made out of stone or marble that's come from the earth, but then is petrified and is there in the pile. So he's become part of this, whole landscape of things that have influenced him, not only the nature, but also the sort of image tradition that John is working with self-consciously. And then there's a couple details of what happens with himself. And what he says, late in another interview about all this, which I think is just a beautiful sentiment, is the real intent of art is memento mori. The world is in every aspect and prospect infinitely lovely and beautiful, and I who observe it, though I have a brief moment of joy, am only destined for illness and death. Stay with me, it's more positive. And that nothing will exist, nothing of the bad, but my God, nothing of the good or joyous either. So this is what art says. Be of good faith, for there is nothing we can do but do. There is no good, no evil, only the thing in the moment, the marvelous beauty of the vista, just now, not later, and death claws at your flanks, but poignancy and grace, the only virtues in the face of false pride, false progress, false values, false everything, except the moment of love and the moment of death. I say, join in, be of good cheer, with the cordiality and goodness of heart. How can we, who all suffer the same dread fate, feel anything but warm, awesome love for one and another? So ultimately, that's sort of what John came up with in thinking about his relationship to cycles and also his relationship to the environment and his consciousness of how he was going to go back into it in a different way. And I just want to leave you with this further instance of a painting, Fruits from John's Garden, that he painted in 1952 to show that he was simultaneously always doing these in addition to the allegorical pictures. And I think even though we might not see these paintings in that way, allegorically, with all these heavy, sort of bigger things in them, John is thinking about that in a greater cosmological way when he's making still lifes. So the last sort of group of people I want to talk about, just sort of pair, I don't know if they knew one another. I've never talked to Tom about this, but it's Tom Uttech and Truman Lowe. So Tom Uttech, this is one of the kinds of paintings that he's best known for, perhaps. I don't know how much you all know about this. A lot of his work is up in the museum. They're really a great collection of Tom's work, and much of it is on display right now, is the result of innumerable hours spent in the woods in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, as well as in his spiritual home of Quetico Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. And the scenes that are presented, like this one, from about 2011, 2012, do not depict specific vistas recreated from sketches or photographs. He's photographed the dense woods, and photographs like this. There's one of them is upstairs. But his paintings are composed from an imaginative conjuring of colors and sounds and textures and emotional states and physical sensations that he's internalized of these places. He begins with a blank surface and approaches the foundation drawing with a piece of vine charcoal. And you can see him, there's videos of him online when he's starting pictures, with his right hand and a piece of cloth in his left. And he's constantly, it's almost like he's improvising. He's really sort of recreating these things. It's amazing. And so, he's, all of these experiences are things, are based on things, and these paintings are based on things that Tom has himself witnessed in camping, being out in the wilderness. And not just, in some ordinary forest, but really deep into places where you can't bring motorboats or anything like that. Really have to get down deep into the woods. And so, I think in some ways, while I know that he's, fond of Aldo Leopold, I think he also has something in common with somebody like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, in his essay Nature, illuminates a sense of merging with one's environment that I think is at the heart of Tom's imagery too. He wrote, this is Emerson, "In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I can feel nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, All mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. The name of the nearest friend sounds then foreign and accidental. I am the lover of uncontained and immoral beauty. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and conate than in streets and villages. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, we behold somewhat as beautiful our own nature. And elsewhere, Emerson remarks, every object rightly seen unlocks a new faculty of the soul. And I think Uttech's remarks about being in Quetico, for instance, is receptive to the life that's churning and buzzing around him while he's there, echo Emerson. Tom said to an interviewer, in the wilderness, I often experience what I call peak time, and I want my paintings to be about the feeling and experience at that moment of perception when every sense is open and magnificent beauty overwhelms me. So while you might know those later paintings, like the first one that I showed, I want to just show you a couple other very early examples, even earlier than the diptych that's upstairs from 1974. This is from 71, and it's part of a small group of paintings that he did that were really his way of getting back into painting after not doing it for a long time, having this period of being dismayed and not really feeling like he was in tune with what he was doing or the greater art world and was rejecting the art world. He spent some time focusing on teaching and staying home with his daughter, his young daughter, and just drawing with her and thinking to himself, I'm not making art. This is not what I'm doing. And spontaneously, this sort of female deer figure started to emerge when he was doing this. And he felt like he needed to pay attention to this figure that came out of nowhere that he hadn't intentionally drawn and start finding out where she's going and what she wants and what she has to do with who he is and start putting her in these situations. So that's what this is where this sort of body of work emerged, which led him into basically what he's doing now. It was a gradual finding of himself, figuring out what his relationship between art and the relationship between the landscape that he loved so much and he felt his soul was. So in this, a painting called Feeding the Pitcher Plant, there's this lunar phenomenon happening above it, but what happens is these kind of twittering spruce tree, it's a spruce tree bog that he's visiting, that's what this is based on. They appear to sort of twitch and slither, almost like they're creatures, and they're shapes that are darker than even the night sky here. But more insect than plant is this plant in the center here that has an uncanny form, and a metamorphosis is happening. There's these writhing pitcher plants, and there's a creature with the body of a woman and head emerging from the central plant here. And it seethes with this energy, bathing the creature's light body in a warm phosphorescent glow. There's black moths that are landing on the figure, and they seem to be stuck and dissolved and digested into its flesh. And they feed her, and perhaps there's this kind of symbiotic relationship with the pitcher plant. Maybe in some ways, it's Tom Uttech also thinking about his relationship between absorbing the landscape and putting it in these new sort of fantastic scenarios. And there's another painting from 71 called Moth Eater that also uses that same sort of character. And in that, he situates this creature on the ground there and deep into the night with these cold white stars pricking the black sky. And there's a smooth glass body of water that's reflecting these sort of strange plants that are forming in the sky. And here, we have this body that has, again, ghostly white silhouettes of these moths that are landing. But what happens is that her breasts have become these amphibious creatures, almost like frogs that are sticking out their tongues to capture them. So these hybrid creatures and this merging of body and environment is happening in these paintings, which gradually becomes more pronounced as Tom develops his work. And then you get a painting like this that he does in 1974, which is another kind of breakthrough. Again, it's a landscape that's based on experience, but then it's a reimagining of that, and it's all kind of coming out in a way that's unusual and fantastic. I think in this kind of painting, it underscores a kind of sensation that some feel when they are the only human being alone deep in the forest, because these birch bark trees that look like they have eyes, and while he has the deer-headed creature in there emerging again from a pitcher plant, there's this figure that is formed from the birch bark that's sort of moving out, emerging, and looks like it is seeing you and looking back at you, and demands maybe to be recognized and talked to. So all of these kinds of things start to happen in Tom's work around this time, which leads to the migration. Truman Lowe, somebody who worked with natural materials and tried to honor sort of the experience that he had in Wisconsin landscapes, particularly around the Wisconsin River, said it is my responsibility as an artist to interpret and make visual the influences of my environment. My work is an aesthetic examination of my immediate environment and of earlier people who lived in this region and created objects and stories reflective of their time. It involves patterns taken from nature, including the canoe form, which has remained unchanged since first contact, and shelters built from materials taken from the environment. So while Truman Lowe's not part of the show upstairs, there are other artists who are in this exhibition who are using natural materials to make analogous forms to the natural world, making almost like a new kind of thing that looks like it could be natural but is completely artificial. And Truman did this a lot, especially with using wood and sapling strips to evoke water and the rushing of water, like in these waterfall sculptures, where the space around them and the smell of them is as important as their forms. And he's thinking about things like deep time and layers and strata, and how water becomes a shaper over millions of years of earth and terrain. For the canoe, this feather canoe piece, which is installed so that it is above the viewer when it's properly installed, he said he was trying to give the feeling of being on the earth while being suspended above it. And it's a form that was meaningful for him because it's made from expertly over many, many generations of learning from, natural elements, wood and hide and other things. And it takes us physically, emotionally, intellectually, and metaphorically, all ways, traveling through a landscape, traveling through the world. And it can be a metaphor for life, birth, and being part of a stream of time. And this idea of soaring and feeling like you're in between spaces is, I think, why he's also included the feathers. So finally, the last thing I just wanted to leave you with to consider is how other artists in this state, and I think really uniquely in this state, in a way that there are some examples elsewhere, but there's a high concentration here, is how artists have been inspired by the areas around their land and their houses, and have tried to connect that physically with new kinds of built structures that they were compelled to make without any formal training whatsoever. And every year since I've moved with my family to Minnesota from Philadelphia area, even though I was from here originally, I've taken my kids on a road trip around the Midwest to see these places. And so maybe you've been to them. And if you haven't, I all urge you to make sure you go see them. They've been preserved by the Kohler Art Foundation, almost all of the ones that I'm going to show you. And they are very much about artists thinking environmentally and thinking about landscape and their relationship to them and their families and their livelihoods and the stories that are told in these places. They're a physical manifestation of all that. Whether it's Fred Smith's Concrete Park, made by this man here between 1950 and 1964, or Prairie Moon, made by Herman Rush between 1958 and 1974, that's near Fountain City, Wisconsin. Dr. Evermore, Tom Every, whose art park is off Highway 12 by the old Badger munitions plant, hidden away, even though once you're there, you can't believe that it's somehow hidden away. Nick Engelbert's Grandview, which is just south of Madison, which he made between the 1930s and 1961, and then started painting for the first time. The Wegner Grotto, made between 1929 and 1936 by Paul and Matilda Wegner, who are also buried down the road in the cemetery with gravestones that are decorated exactly like the way that they made these shrines to peace and world religions in a particular park, inspired by the Holy Ghost Park in Dickeyville, or the Dickeyville Grotto, which is this, made by Father Matthias Veneris between 1925 and 1930. Jurustic Park, made by Clyde Winia, who's still alive, and will show you how things move and are touchable and able to make sound with big hammers. That's just outside of Wausau. The Rudolph Grotto is just down the road from there, made by Father Philip Wagner and Edmund Ribicki, which includes the natural elements, shrines, but also a human-made cave, which probably would terrify some people to try to walk through, but is there and is a marvel. And that was made between 1919 and 1959, and then finished in 1983 by Edmund Ribicki, who started helping Father Wagner when he was 12. And then the James Talon Woodland Sculpture Garden, which is in Sheboygan and is right near the sort of edge of Lake Michigan, done between 1942 and 1957. And finally, Mary Knowles House, which the Colorado Foundation is preserving and trying to establish as a place that can be perpetually visited on a very, very, very limited basis by people in order to keep it the way it is. So why do these people do this? Why in Wisconsin is there this high concentration of all these kinds of sites that try to bring the forest closer and make a relationship between these monumental figures and you as a visitor, and also these people who are living with these things, gathering them around? I'm not entirely sure. I have some theories, but I've said enough. And so I hope you have questions. I hope some of you have answers to that. But thank you for listening.